Henry Vanover was born in 1835 to Daniel and Nancy Vanover. During the Civil War, he served as a private with the Union Army. After the war, the U.S. government deeded him 900 acres of land in lieu of pay for his service. This land is located approximately 2 miles down the Elkhorn Creek from the present-day town of Jenkins, Kentucky. The land stretched across both sides of the Elkhorn Creek and includes the present-day sites of Burdine, East Jenkins, what is now called Number 3 Hollow, Joe's Branch, and Camden. Henry never sold any land. However, from time to time he would sell walnut, maple, and oak timber from the land and use the proceeds to purchase more land. Henry had acquired some of the richest, choicest timberland in Kentucky and Virginia. As he continued to selectively log, he became a wealthy man and the owner of large tracts of land in both states. It is of importance to note here that coal had not yet been developed on the Elkhorn Creek in Kentucky. But in 1883 Richard Brose came to the area and started his survey on Henry Vanover's land. It was in this way that Henry discovered that not only did he own some of the best timberlands in both states, but in Kentucky he had been granted a significant portion of the richest coal land in the country by the U.S. government. However, as quite a few people can attest, with the acquisition of wealth and valuable land, problems arise. In May 1879, Henry Vanover's niece, Polly Louanza Estep, the daughter of his sister Mary and John Estep, married Ira Mullins, the son of John L. and Martha Mullins of Pike County. And a little over a year later, the first of many troubles would arise between Ira Mullins and Henry Vanover. Ira, or Bad Ira, Mullins, as he was locally known, was a big-time moonshiner and corn whiskey runner by trade. It is also said that he was a small-time merchant as well, but we could find no record of him owning a general store or mercantile on the Elkhorn Creek. It is possible that he later owned such a business in Virginia, but it is also just as likely that his business or story of it is used as a front for his illegal endeavors. On October 21st, 1880, Ira Mullins would be arrested, fined $25, and spend 10 days in the Whitesburg, Kentucky jail. The only information we can find about the case is that the indictment which states that Ira was carrying a concealed and deadly weapon. The indictment was used by the jury to record the sentence and the fine, and as a scratch pad by the county clerk to tabulate $12.85 in court fees. The indictment lists the witnesses for the Commonwealth as well: Morgan Killers, Henry Vanover, and a man that is repeatedly associated with the story of Pound Gap Massacre, Isaac Belcher. In the mid-1880s, Ira and Louanza Mullins moved to Elkhorn Creek and settled in a cabin that was built on a plot of land owned by Henry Vanover. Although Henry informed Ira and his niece that the property and the cabin in which they were now living was owned by him, there is nothing to indicate that he asked them to leave, either verbally or in a court record. What we do know is about this time, someone started trying to kill Henry Vanover. After a hard day's work on May 28, 1885, Henry and his family were sitting on the porch of his home, having dinner and enjoying the cool evening breeze. A man riding a horse was casually traveling by the Vanover home. This man stopped in the middle of the Elkhorn Creek in front of Henry's home. At that time, the creek was in use as a road. After calmly sitting there for a few minutes, the man drew his rifle and began shooting at Henry and his family. Henry quickly grabbed his rifle and returned fire. The would-be assassin spurred his horse and quickly rode off, but apparently not before Henry recognized the man. The attempted assassin was a man named James Roberts from Ohio, who was known to be a guest staying at the home of Ira Mullins. Henry then decided to wait and see if the man would attempt to ride by his home again. When he later appeared on the road, Henry Vanover opened fire, shooting Roberts from his horse and killing him. Henry Vanover was charged with the murder of Mr. Roberts, but was acquitted due to circumstances. But the troubles for Henry and his family did not end there. Most stories about Henry Vanover tells us that on June 18, 1887, while working the fields in Rocky Hollow with his wife, Henry Vanover was ambushed and killed. Although the actual killer of Henry Vanover remains unknown, it is widely thought that Clifton Branham had murdered Henry Vanover. Clifton was arrested and tried for the crime, although there was very little evidence, and Clifton claimed to be at home with his wife and family that day. He was convicted of conspiracy and criminal complicity and would spend 15 years of a 90-year term in prison. Clifton always denied the Vanover murder and claimed, quote, "I got some money for the killing, but I did not kill Henry Vanover," unquote. But thanks to digitalization efforts that have taken place over the last 10 years, we can now piece a different story together. On page 8 of the Kentucky newspaper, the Hazel Green Herald, dated Friday, August 12, 1887, is two sentences. They simply tell us that Clifton Branham and his brother Tan were in jail charged with the killing of Vanover. They made a confession implicating several others. Tan was Clifton's brother, Tandy Branham. They were both given life sentences in the Kentucky State Prison at Frankfort in Franklin County for the murder of Henry Vanover. But according to page 3 of the Hopkinsville Kentuckian, dated June the 24th, 1892, Tandy Branham was one of the, quote, "unfortunates," unquote, serving a life sentence for murder in the Eddyville Penitentiary, who was adjudicated insane and sent to an asylum. Although we can find no exact date, Tandy was released from the asylum prior to August 1896. We know this thanks to two Kentucky newspaper clippings from August and November of that year. The first comes from the Daily Leader, now the Lexington Herald, dated August the 12th, 1896. The second is from the Richmond Climax, dated November 25th, 1896. These two papers inform us that Tandy was murdered on August 11th, and although his killer had been caught, he refused to give his name. The second clip tells us that his killer was 18-year-old Coon Willis, and informs us that Mr. Willis pleaded guilty and received a life sentence instead of facing jail. And informs us that Mr. Willis pleaded guilty and received a life sentence instead of facing trial. Clifton's story is a little more interesting. Clifton and Tandy apparently took a similar deal to that of Coon Willis, choosing life in prison rather than face trial and the gallows. Clifton's story is summarized and can be found on page 11 of the Louisville, Kentucky's Courier Journal, dated September the 26th, 1903. In 1899, Clifton would follow the footsteps of his brother Tandy and feign insanity. He would then be transferred to the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum in Lexington, Kentucky. Clifton would spend a total of 6 months in the asylum before he was released. In all, Clifton Branham would spend 12 years locked up for the murder of Henry Vanover. Clifton would be tried and hung for the murder of his wife in 1903. However, there is another oddity in the story about Clifton Branham and the murder of Henry. The story tells us that, quote, "the actual killer of Henry Vanover remains unknown. It was widely thought that Clifton Branham had murdered Henry Vanover," unquote. It goes on to tell us that, quote, "Clifton always denied the Vanover murder and claimed, 'I got some money for the killing, but I did not kill Henry Vanover,' unquote." Some websites are now reporting in snippets that there was a third man who was tried and sent to prison for the murder of Henry Vanover at the same time. These snippets are found on genealogy websites and articles about both men, and give this third man's name as George Johnson. After an exhaustive search, we can find no mention of any man associated with the murder of Henry Vanover, other than those asserting that Ira Mullins was the man who paid the Branham brothers. We did find that Clifton and Tandy confessed to the crime implicating others. Was George Johnson one of the persons implicated in the confession? Or is it possible that this is a distortion to hide the simple truth? In several of the stories about Clifton Branham, we are told that he was quite the ladies' man. It is even implied that it was one of the reasons he spent so much time away from home and his wife. We are also told that Clifton was also fond of an alias that he often used on these occasions. Clifton often used the alias George Jones. Could it be that the third man was actually a split personality? Could it be that both Clifton and Tandy Branham were both insane? After Henry's death, his widow Sarah was left to raise their children on their own. However, having a large timber-producing estate did not make it any easier. At one point, Sarah was facing 100 lawsuits from people claiming Henry's land, including a lawsuit from Ira and Louanza Mullins. About this time, Henry Vanover's oldest daughter, Catherine, had caught the eye of Heenan Fleming, and he and his brother Calvin were often visitors at the Vanover house helping with the farm. Eventually, Heenan would marry Catherine. Doc Taylor was a close friend of Henry Vanover's and became involved in several of the lawsuits against the widow Vanover, including one with Ira Mullins. If Clifton Branham had knowledge of who actually killed Henry Vanover, he kept silent about it. He also never told who he had received money from for the assassination. However, everyone suspected that it was from Ira Mullins and his wife Louanza. Most people figured that it was a shootout at Wise that started the feud between Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor and Ira Mullins. However, it is of particular interest to note that Taylor would become a federal marshal in 1889, 2 years after the death of Henry Vanover, and start his war against moonshiners. It is also telling in the fact that Taylor chose the pursuit and the capture of moonshine runners coming from Kentucky into Virginia. Taylor was also known to camp out at what is now known as Raven Rock and spy on the road below using his 5-foot spyglass, and then set a trap for the runners at the top of the mountain. Over the next 4 years, Taylor would lead an assault against illegal whiskey that many came to say was his personal vendetta against moonshiners. He would also gain fame as an herbalist and a spiritual leader, often staying with his patients for an extended times until they were well. It is also during this time that he would acquire the nickname the Red Fox and take on a persona of being a mystic. Thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we bring to you the history of the Appalachian Mountains. Please like, subscribe, and share below. Also hit the bell for notifications of future videos. And once again, be sure to leave us a "Hey y'all" in the comments section below.